So there are four really important points about objects. The first really important point is that you can make constructor functions. Constructor functions typically start with an uppercase letter. They use the this field internally, and then you call the constructor function using new to make instances of the class. The second really important point is that if the constructor function is going to define a method, it ought to use the prototype property so that the function in memory is not repeated for each instance of the class. The third really important point is you can have anonymous objects. If you just want a piece of data in your code that contains some properties, and you only have one piece of data that is in that format, you don't have to make a constructor function first. You can define the object directly, an anonymous object or an object literal. And the fourth really important point is JSON. Anonymous objects in a restricted format inside strings can be interpreted with json.parse, and that's important because we're going to send those strings to the browser from the server later. Okay, so those are four really important points, but there's a small set of additional object tricks that are worth knowing about. The first is the instance of operator. The idea is that it checks if the argument on the left-hand side of the operator is a member of the class on the right-hand side. You can say, oh, is the thing that you passed me an array? Now, in languages like C# or Java, you never have to ask this because you declare the type ahead of time and you know what the subtypes are. So when you declare a variable, you give its type. And so you know right away whether it's an array or not. But in JavaScript, it's just var, or when you make a function, you just give the variable name. And if you want to query it later and see if it's of a certain type, you can use instance of. However, I want to warn you that heavy use of instance of basically amounts to trying to write an object-oriented programming language that JavaScript doesn't already support. But if you use it lightly, it's sometimes useful. The type of operator is also sometimes useful, and it has 5 possible values. You give an operand, and it says, and you ask type of, and it either says number, string, Boolean, object, function, or undefined. That's it. It won't say person, it won't say circle, it just says those possible values. And arrays and null, they all say object. So, type of a variable, it'll say number. Type of a variable, it'll say string. Type of, well, I never defined this variable, well, it won't crash, it'll just say undefined. And last, but certainly not least, you can add methods to classes that already exist. So you just use the prototype property. Now, Java programmers have heart attacks or faint or go into fits when you say this. Because in Java, you can protect your code so nobody else can mess around with it. What this really means is that you never know what your JavaScript code is really going to do if you are loading somebody else's JavaScript code also. Because their JavaScript code can replace your functions, can add additional methods to your classes. They can even replace built-in methods or add additional methods to built-in classes. Now, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is debatable. Some people use this idea to basically extend the entire JavaScript language. The prototype JavaScript library basically did this. So once you loaded prototype, you might argue, well, I'm not really programming in JavaScript anymore. I'm programming in, I don't know, JavaScript++. And so they just added a whole bunch of things to the core JavaScript language and added things to the built-in classes, in particular arrays. Other people say, oh, this is very dangerous. Well, I don't know whether it's dangerous or a good thing. It's powerful, certainly. But whether you like it or not, this is what JavaScript supports. So string is already built in. By using the prototype variable, I can add a new method to the string class. Once I do this, every string that's ever created in the rest of my JavaScript program will automatically have an additional method. Let me give you an example. So I use the prototype property to add a new method, a property, class level property whose value is a function, in other words, a method, to string. And so now all strings in the future will have a describe length method. So I run this, and then I say var s equals hello. And then I say s dot describe length. and it says my length is 5. And so even though string was built in, I can add additional methods to it. Or I could even go to one of the built-in methods and replace it with my own version. And so this is very powerful, but it's also a little bit dangerous. And so you have to realize if you load somebody else's JavaScript file, they might, at least in principle, mess with your code or mess with the built-in code, and there is no way to stop it.